Okay, so here we are, Intro to Judaism, session 3, and we're taking questions about anything as we get started. So, Beverly, please.
This wasn't on the subject, but it's something I wanted to know because I was wanting to sit back getting one. Instead of just a regular Siddur, the Maxur, is there a Reform Maxur?
There is. We don't. So, is there a Reform Machzor? So, first of all, what's a Machzor? What's a Siddur?
For the holidays.
So, a Siddur, the root is Seder, which we'll talk about at Passover. It means prayer. It means order, and that's because there's an order to our prayers. A Machzor is the Siddur, is the prayer book that we that we return to year after year after year at special occasions. And so you do not need to own your own Machzor. You can. The Machzor we use is called Machzor Hadash, which is a conservative movement. Well, it's not associated with the movement, but it's a conservative Machzor, and we lead a Reform service out of it. The Reform movement just put together a new Reform Machzor called Mishkan HaNefesh, which is the gates of the soul. It's the translation. Siddur Chadash or Machzor Chadash is like the new Machzor. Mishkan HaNefesh you can find on the CCAR Press, ccrpress.org, I think, is what the website is. It could be .com. CCAR is the Central Conference of American Rabbis, and it is that's the Reform Rabbinate in America and beyond.
Okay, that was good.
And so, if you're coming to services, then you don't have to worry about having your own Machzor. Like, we'll have it, unless you want to. Okay. Yeah, we have them available for everybody. So they were donated to the congregation, and sold by the congregation or purchased by the congregation. So everybody has one. So we provide everything that you need. But if there are some people who do like to have their own and would want to have their own, right? And so you have a chance to look at things ahead of time and whatnot. And so those are the ones. The Mishkan HaNefesh is beautifully innovative and very different than what you'll see in a traditional Machzor. They've really tried to make things more theologically in line with where most Reform Jews are. Like, one of the things that you read about on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is the notion of, God up in the sky, or that notion of God in the sky, right? Writing our names in the book of life or the book of death. And for a lot of modern Jews, that's not the way they look at God, right? In that way, in the same way. And so they kind of downplayed some of that theology and brought in some other aspects of Jewish theology that are more in line with where modern Reform Jews are. And they really tried to unpack what is the point of praying on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And there's a lot of innovation. They really did a lot of creative things with the shofar service and other such things. For those of you who here at CBI, there hasn't been that much interest in doing things that different, that kind of a radical change. And what we do is really nice, really, really nice. And of course, what you can do with a prayer book, but a prayer book is more palette as opposed to the finished product, right? And so, like in our Machzor, we have a whole booklet of additional readings to expand the palette and allow us to do things a little bit differently. So it's a good question. It's an important question. Any other questions before we jump in today? Okay. There's not one, there's lots. And so let's talk about that. We're going to put that aside for now, and but we will talk about it. We'll definitely talk about Reformed theology. Okay, and so, and here it is recorded at this time at the, I don't have the counter on it, so I can't tell, but we're somewhere around 5 minutes or so into the official recording, and we'll go back and review session 3, and we will remember that we need to talk about theology if we haven't done it. But there's a lot. Amy here, sorry, my apologies. Any questions from last session? Did you get the recording from last session? You saw it? It worked, right?
The only issue was that I found could be my hearing. When someone would ask a question, it was very difficult to hear it. And so sometimes you would start in and you'd be like 2 or 3 sentences in before I figure out, oh, that's what
the question was. All right, that's a good point. And so help me remember, I think for the mock store question that we just answered, I think that I think I did okay, but I will try to remember to repeat the question before I continue on. That's for you.
I do have a question.
Yes.
So last week you said that canonization was a radical process.
Yes.
Not only to the Christian Bible or the Hebrew Bible and
The Jewish Bible, Christian Bible, the Quran, the Hadith, the Talmud. I mean, anytime, any work that is seen and understood as sacred, any collection, and you say this is in and this is out. It's a radical process.
Okay, so it's a radical process.
Yeah, the act of canonization, the act of canonizing anything, the act of saying, I mean, we had all the think about it, all the Federalist Papers, right? The act of saying this is the Constitution and all of the other ideas that we have thought about that could have gone in, that is a radical process, right? That is jarring. And it's important though, right? Everything can't be a part of the canon. That question, by the way, was about if canonization related just to Judaism, the Jewish Bible and the Christian, or just the Christian Bible, or if it also applied to the Jewish Bible. So we went to everything, any act of canonization. So go ahead. Okay, so there was a Telushkin quote that we're actually going to get to as we continue on here, but there was a quote in Telushkin about how the patriarchs and matriarchs may have operated on equal footing. So in a social perspective, if there was some level of gender equality. I do not believe that to necessarily be the case, although there are certainly things that we can point to within the Bible that are relatively refreshing. But no. Yeah. Yeah, I don't necessarily agree with Telushkin on that. Although I could understand, we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it a little bit more. So what we're going to look at today is the Torah, the good parts version. And so we are, and if anybody ever read The Princess Bride, not see the movie, but read the book, The Princess Bride. The Princess Bride, phenomenal book, even better than the movie. And it's couched as, like, the subheading is the good parts version, because he purports that it's part of a longer book. It doesn't actually exist. Like, it was just like there's a whole prelude that goes into it, which is phenomenal. So Torah, the good parts version. Keep in mind that I'm going to bring in rabbinic interpretation as we discuss these issues and these topics. And as we do so, Rabbinic interpretation does take things pretty literally sometimes. It does take things, it does kind of fill in a lot of the gaps at others. And when we talk about the Torah, actually, in addition to that, when we talk about the Torah from a traditional Jewish perspective, we are talking not only about what it says in terms of the words and the stories and the laws and those kinds of things, it's also through the lens of rabbinic interpretation, incorporating all of the stories and interpretations and all of the variety that that entails. So that's actually really important to understand. Also know that in addition to the traditional rabbinic perspective, I also, and again, you will not get this in Telushkin, but I'll also be offering comments on occasion relating to the critical historical understanding of the Bible and how that can add to our understanding, that can add to the text. So, without further, and this is why I want you to read Telushkin, and I also want you to hear me, right? Because if you have a chance to keep up with the readings and can go through, you will see that it's very, like some of the stuff that we say is very similar, and some of the stuff we say is very different. And that's Judaism, right? Like that's how we disagree, all those kinds of things. That is very much a part of the process. So in the Torah, let's start off with creation. Let's acknowledge the fact that there are two creation stories. For those of you who have read your Bible really, really well, you know that in the first chapter of Genesis and the first few verses in chapter 2, you basically have God who creates by speaking, let there be light. You have God who creates light on the first day, but the stars and the moon and the sky don't get created until the fourth day. I mentioned that last time, right? But you also have this idea that man and woman are created in God's image together at the same time. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is very different. God forms man. It's not by speaking. God forms man, breathes into his nostrils, right? Instead of let there be man and woman, let there be light, let there be, right? It's very physical. It's a really interesting image. God actually picks up Adam and places him into the Garden of Eden. That's what it's saying, and that's how it's written in chapter 2. But there's a lot of contradictions as well, because it specifically says when God creates man that there was no vegetation on earth. It says that in chapter 2. Day 3 was vegetation. People didn't get created until day 6, right? There's things that are inherently contradictory. And in addition to the fact that you may have, has anyone heard of this notion that there are different authors when it comes to the Bible, right? Some people may have heard of J.E.P., right? Those kinds of things. So in chapter 1 and chapter 2, the difference couldn't be starker. Bereshit bara Elohim, when God began to create, God is referred to as Elohim. All throughout chapter 1, Elohim, 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 that's all it says. That's the only name for God in chapter 1. In chapter 2, it's Adonai Elohim, Yud He Vav He Elohim, often translated as the Lord God. But if you go to, again, in most English Bibles, you should be able to, they should translate that as two different names. Elohim is often translated as God, capital G, and Adonai Elohim is often translated as the Lord God or something along those lines. So that's where you get the idea of an Elohist, right? One who uses Elohim exclusively, and one who uses God's name, Yud He Vav He, which is where the J comes from, the Yahwist, which becomes a J in German. And so I would argue that there's multiple authors, not just 4 or 5, and that's at least how I studied it and understood it. But the idea of these two creation stories is that they are diametrically opposed, or at least they're very, very different. They both get us to this Garden of Eden, right, eventually. But why? Why would you have two different stories? Why would they be placed side by side next to each other? It's because both of them have something to teach us. So, what's the first thing created?
Light.
Light. What's created before light? It says, Ruach Elohim, the spirit or the wind or the breath of God. It was hovering over what? Water. Yes. Where did the water come from? When was the water created? Before there was Darwinism, before there was evolution, Rashi, about 1,000 years ago, pointed out that Scripture never tells us when the water was created. So this couldn't be the beginning of everything. It's just the beginning of when God began to create the heaven and the earth. And he says that if you think that this meant that the story of creation, that Genesis chapter 1 was supposed to be teaching us the history as we understand it today, that this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Rashi's words, translated into English, you must question yourself. You must question yourself. Because that's not what God was trying to teach us. God wasn't trying to teach us history through the creation stories. So what was God trying to teach us? Our rabbis will ask the question, why do you start with creation? Because the Torah is, from a rabbinic perspective, it's a book of law. Do you remember how many commandments? Did we talk about that yet? May not have. 613 commandments, right? And so the 613 commandments, why don't we start with the first commandment? Who cares about creation? That's a question that it turns out that God cared about creation, or as far as the rabbis were concerned, right? Why do we have the creation of the world as the start of the Torah? What's so important about it? It's supposed to teach us, and this is Rashi, but it's also built on other rabbinic commentaries, Midrash. I think it's Rabbi Yitzchak, who is the Midrashic author, who offers this, that the essential version, essential understanding is that the world doesn't belong to us. The world belongs to God. And so what do our creation stories tell us? They teach us to orient ourselves, how to orient ourselves towards God, towards the world, towards nature, towards other people. This is the point. This is the story. The reason why we begin with creation, not to teach us history. Reform Judaism and most forms of Judaism are very, very comfortable with the idea that the earth is billions of years old as opposed to less than 6,000. Even though, according to the Jewish calendar, we are going to be celebrating 5780 in just a couple weeks. So this is the idea of the two creation stories from both a rabbinic perspective as well as from a more critical historical perspective. But you can see that as I teach it, at least from my perspective, I think that those two views, those two understandings and approaches, they work beautifully together. Really, really beautifully together. We've got Adam and Eve. I told you before, and for those who read Telushkin, you found out that original sin, we don't have it in Judaism. The idea that I would summarize, I think, again, you have people who are going to disagree with me, of course, but I would summarize Jewish philosophy when it comes to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and Eve eating the apple as the general Jewish attitude is it was inevitable. Because until Eve ate the apple, or the fig, or the pomegranate, or the piece of wheat, or whatever else it might have been, because there's lots of different rabbinic interpretations as to what that fruit was, history doesn't begin. Right? The idea that if you eat the fruit, you will die, it doesn't necessarily mean right away. It just means that you will die. You will not be immortal. Right? And when Adam and Eve eat the fruit, God makes this comment about, well, now they've become like us. Right? Angelic beings, immortal beings. So that's not going to work. Humans have to be able to die. We get kicked out of the Garden of Eden. We'll live our life. We have a relatively, again, it was a long lifespan back in Genesis, according to what we read in the text. But we have a relatively short lifespan, and we need to make the most of it. It doesn't begin. History doesn't begin until we eat it. And so instead of tainting all of humanity with the sin of the first people, that's just not how we view it. That's not how we understand it. Although there are some Jews over the years that have maybe feel a little bit of an affinity for that perspective. However, that's not the mainstream understanding. Amy, it looked like you were about to ask a question.
Yes. So the first question is, so what purpose does it serve to have people die? Because he said,
Again, the question was, thank you. Question was, what purpose does it serve to have man die? And I would say that it was what the Adam and Eve story is about is it is a reflection of the world as we know it. We know that people are going to die. We know that if someone tells us, and again, you can look through the Adam and Eve story and the early evolution of the initial stories as really humanity in its infancy and humanity as children and the gaining of knowledge, learning through our mistakes, right? I mean, there's all sorts of things that psychologically we can bring into this notion. But that idea that it was, when I say that it was inevitable for history to begin, the Garden of Eden is not the world as we know it. Something had to have happened, right, is the idea. And so when I say that it was inevitable, it's because either God or the authors of the Bible, however we look at it, however we understand it, they were reflecting and helping to teach us about the world as we know it today.
Rabbi, one thing as I started doing the reading this last week, I think that's one of the first examples of where we're being told that going against God has consequences. We see that again when Moses goes against God in the way he brings water for him. So we cannot go into Israel. So that happens again and again when they're telling us, when God is telling us to do something, we do have the choice to go against that, but there are consequences of doing that.
Yes. And so that's exactly it. And so the comment was that we have the opportunity, or this is the first example and of many within our Bible, that if we go against God, there are consequences. And that philosophy is so strong. When we get to Deuteronomy, we're going to talk about that a lot, right? Because that's what Deuteronomy is, basically. And so, once again, it is a reflection of life as we know it and as we experience it today, right? There's a beautiful line in Deuteronomy that we just read last week or the week before in the Torah. And it says that basically, if you follow the laws, there will never be any needy in your settlements. And then a few verses later, it says, There will always be people who are needy. Why? Because we are never going to get it right. We're right. I mean, this is our eternal existence. We know Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur are coming up. We have never in our history had to cancel Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur because we have nothing to repent for. We have nothing, right? We've never done it right. Why? Because we're humans. And so Adam and Eve, the first humans, of course they're going to make mistakes. Of course they're going to mess up, right? And that's one of the beauties of the story, and one of the things that it teaches us. Don't be so hard on ourselves, right? Look what Adam and Eve did, right? I mean, but we can look at that all the way throughout. And so the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, the idea of the snake, and there's a lot of stuff. Again, our rabbis look at everything, right? I mean, like, you probably haven't heard the story that the snake was attracted to Eve, or have you? So, yeah, I mean, that's great rabbinic interpretation. That's like, I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that when you really get into it, there's a lot of interesting and surprising kind of interpretations that are a part of it. But the idea of the sin in the garden as being inevitable, as being reflective that this is humanity. Judaism looks at this in a very different way, right, than certain aspects of Christianity. Right? That it's natural, it's normal, it's a part of who we are, as opposed to, I mean, and we're gullible, right? We believe things that we shouldn't. We can trust people when we shouldn't, right? Like, all of these kinds of things are, a part of who we are, right? And so it's human fallacy, and you see that over and over and over again. And that's actually one of the reasons why, in my opinion, the Torah and our Bible continue to be such powerful lessons, because they reflect, right? We don't have, like in Judaism, we don't have a Jesus figure. We don't have the idea of perfection. God is said to be perfect, but even God makes mistakes. We'll get there in a moment. So you have this idea of, right, that of our Bible and the stories in our Bible reflecting life as we know it, over and over and over again, including some of the horrors, because there are many, many horrors described in the Bible, and as we know, there are many horrors in life. Kind of go on to Cain and Abel, right? Because this is like we can talk about any one of these for the whole time, right? Like, this is kind of the short version, and we are going to spend a little bit more time on some versus others. Cain and Abel, I forgot, I want to say it was Nachmanides, but I don't remember. Now I'm questioning. I don't remember who it was who acknowledge and point out that Cain didn't know that he was going to murder Abel. He was just angry. But at that point in time, no one had ever died. Right? And so there's all sorts of really beautiful and powerful interpretations, right, around Cain and Abel and the Cain and Abel story. The idea, the acknowledgement of, I mean, you get brothers and you get jealousy and you get God playing into the jealousy of one versus the other, right? God didn't care a lick about Cain's offering, but Abel's was pretty special, right? I mean, really, really powerful Because sibling rivalry happens today. Jealousies happen today, petty and otherwise. Favoritism happens today. Again, God as parents favoring one over another. I mean, oh, one last thing about Adam and Eve. There's I studied with Dr. Joel Hoffman, who has translated a work, an ancient work that basically tells the story of Adam and Eve after the Garden of Eden, and about how they realized their mistake and they want to get back in. And this is the story, and they actually try to drown, or like they almost drown, so that way they'll be in so much trouble that God will have to help them and take them back. And it really plays into the idea of God as parent, right? I mean, it truly, like in a really powerful way. And so that's not a part of the Bible, not canonized. However, this is, he actually has a whole book on it. He translated it and annotates it and whatnot. But it was made for really fascinating study. So, yeah, Cain and Abel. You have after Cain and Abel, right? The Bible does talk about how there's a lot more children that are had, right? After Abel is killed and Cain is forced to wander, right? The question does come, right? Murder is wrong in everything. And what do you get? You get the death penalty. So how could God allow Cain to live? Wouldn't God have murdered? Right? And the idea of his lack of knowledge of the implications is he knew that it wasn't necessarily right to hit him, but he didn't realize it would kill him. Just kind of fascinating in terms of that kind of discussion and what that holds for us. A few generations later, we end up with Noah's Ark. It says in Genesis chapter 6 that God regrets creating humanity. If God is perfect, can a perfect being regret? Right? By the way, Noah's Ark, not a kid's story. Right? I mean, think about this. And again, this is Dr. David Aaron, who is one of my Bible professors. I remember his sermon on this. You have so much kid stuff with Noah's Ark and all the happy animals, and you got the rainbow, and it's so pretty, and they never draw in all the dead people, right? Like the entire world, all of humanity destroyed. I don't know. I mean, it's really, right? I mean, so let's acknowledge this. There is, right, and some of the things to point out, right? With Noah's Ark, you have parallels in ancient Near Eastern literature, right? You have parallels in other societies, right, with the idea of a great flood. We do not know for sure with regard to, that there's a lot of people who write about a flood, and whether it was just a borrowed literary trope or if there was some historical event, right? There's some people that will look at, how after a flood, you can, archaeologically speaking, you can kind of tell, right, that something big happened there. And so we don't fully know or understand all of where it came from, but you do see the idea of animals being brought in. Again, 2 stories. You got animals being brought in 2 by 2, and then you have, don't forget, for the clean animals, make sure you have 7, right? You have a lot more because you have to slaughter them and offer sacrifices. So you do see those differences in the story and the way that it's told. For those of you who watched the Noah's Ark movie that came out a few years ago, that actually there's aspects of it that was very much rooted in some Jewish midrash and Jewish storytelling, which is really fascinating. There are stories that are told, right? The Torah doesn't tell us what was so evil. It doesn't say it, right? And so what do rabbis do? They fill in the gaps. They talk about what was so evil, what was so bad. Same for Sodom and Gomorrah when we get there, right? That same idea, rabbis fill in those gaps to help us understand what people were doing that were so bad. All it says in the Bible, this part we don't actually focus on that much because we kind of skip over it, right? What do we have in the Bible at the beginning of chapter 6? Angelic beings finding human women attractive, procreating, right? And then having great heroes be created, right? So, I don't know, Allie, if you're a fan of Percy Jackson's series. No? You've read it? Are you a fan or no? I mean, demigods, that's what we're talking about here, right? And what happens? We wipe them out with a flood. No, I mean, think of it. How intentional is that? Because you have in Gilgamesh and Enuma Elish and other such things, the idea of gods procreating, right? And giving rise to heroes or great, people of great renown. And Judaism basically says in Genesis chapter 6, we're wiping away. That's not what we see in this world. We're getting rid of all of those ideas. I mean, it's really fascinating. I mean, and that's not rabbinic necessarily, but you do have rabbinic stories about how could angels do this, right? And so you actually have storytelling along those lines that, I mean, it's fascinating. You've got it's all comes in this genre of midrash, right? This rabbinic storytelling. And there's just a lot of different kinds of things that are said and taught about. Is there a differentiation between good and bad angels? Well, so all angels, according to the Jewish definition, and there are angels in Judaism, they basically do what God says. They do what God says, right? And so those that might be like Hasatan in the story of Job, which we'll get to eventually, but Hasatan is where Satan, the name Satan, comes from. But he's an angel. He's translated sometimes as Hasatan, Satan. He's sometimes translated, I think in the JPS, it translates Hasatan as the adversary with a capital A. Not an adversary. Hasatan is kind of like the prosecuting attorney, right? This is what's happened, right? And maybe he will put people in, like bad situations or this, that, or the other, but it's all to test people and to reflect on humanity's imperfection, right? But doing so at God's behest, right? So you don't have, I mean, you do have devil, you have demons, there's all sorts of stuff we have in Judaism. Lots of stories about demons. I don't necessarily focus on those, although on Halloween, except for Halloween. Halloween I do, like the Friday near Halloween, I'll give some of like the more esoteric sides of Judaism, and I'll talk about like the demons or we've got zombies, we've got all different kinds of great stuff in Judaism and Jewish folklore. I mean, there's a lot of great stuff, right? And so you got to be aware of it. But those kinds of things are, most angels are supposed to follow what God says. And so these angels, they look down and they don't believe God, right? So the angels are like, how terrible are these people? And God's like, you don't know what free will is. If you had free will, it'd be 10 times worse for you. And so the angels say, okay, let's try it. God gives them free will, and it's 10 times worse for them, right? Like it's really horrible, and that is one of the, so instead of God regretting that God created angels, God just creates humanity because it's a story that's told as an explanation. But these are the kinds of things that you see, right? And by the way, when it comes to rabbinic storytelling, one rabbinic story doesn't necessarily have to go along with another rabbinic story. You can have different versions of it. They're all trying to teach lessons, right? That's really what it's all about. They're trying to teach specific lessons. So Noah's Ark, I do want to mention that Noah's Ark is where in the story of after the flood and after things recede, this is where you do have the idea of the Noahide laws. The Noahide laws are rabbinic intervention, 7 laws, right? Again, I mentioned it at one of the other classes. 7 laws that all of humanity has to follow. You have the rainbow. God promises never to destroy the flood, or never destroy the earth with a flood again. And the idea is that there's nothing in the Torah that Noah agrees to. So what does Noah have? What does Noah agree to? Noah agrees to our rabbis create the 7 Noahide laws. These are 7 laws that all of humanity is supposed to follow, and that's very much a part of Noah's Ark. With the Tower of Babel, I think Telushkin covers this one pretty well. Like, there are different interpretations, but the idea of, we don't know why the Tower of Babel is really that evil. And so our rabbis tell stories, right? It says that they wanted to get to God. Are you okay? Or okay? Oh, right, taking notes. Oh, good. Oh, yeah, keep it out to take notes. That works. I didn't know if you were doing another recording of me or something along those lines. I didn't know what was going on. You know, putting together a grocery list. You know, I understand. So no, for note taking, please. But our rabbis tell stories about the Tower of Babel, right? Like, because just building a really high tower doesn't seem to warrant such a horrible thing, a punishment of kind of separating everybody out. And so our rabbis tell stories that people started to care more about bricks than they did the other people. And they would mourn the loss if a brick fell, but someone would fall to their death and they would just step over them, right? Kind of a thing. And so that kind of a notion, our rabbis are telling stories to help us explain what was so horrible about Tower of Babel. However, this is also a beautiful story that helps us to understand that Judaism, unlike most other ancient Near Eastern literature, Judaism acknowledges that Judaism is not the first people to ever exist. Judaism doesn't start with the creation of the first Jews. That's really, really important. We have a creation story, but humanity exists, and guess what? They speak many different languages. How do we understand that? We tell the story of the Tower of Babel. Right? It reflects life as we know it. It explains life as we know it. It is, in that respect, it is not history as we know it, but it does speak to a sense of history. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. It's not the scientific history that we think of, but it is a reflection of the history of the day, the history of the age, which is very significant, highly significant. The covenant in Genesis. The covenant of Genesis is very different than the covenant that God makes with humanity. We talked last time about why Abraham was chosen, right? And there's lots of stories about it. We told the story about the idol shop, and there's also these notions of Abraham who would look up at the sun and be so amazed by the sun and think that it must be that the sun must be, God, and then the moon would come and replace the sun. Mm. Must not be that impressive, the sun, right? If something can come and replace the sun. And so the moon must be, right? The moon is stronger than the sun. And then the sun comes back. And so Abraham's kind of confused. And he's like, well, there must be something greater than all of it that created the sun, the moon, and the stars, those kinds of things. There are all of those, there's all sorts of stories about how Abraham thinks about these issues. To help explain why God said to Abraham, I want you to go here. So, Beverly, you have a question?
Mm-hmm. Did you ever hear a story about Noah's son Shem teaching Abraham?
Yes, actually that, so you have Beverly asked a question about Noah's son Shem teaching Abraham, and this idea of that a yeshiva is set up by Shem and Eber is there's rabbinic storytelling about that helps to explain certain other pieces. Like Rebecca cries out and God answers her. And our rabbis are very specific. God doesn't answer her directly, but through a, it's through a prophet or something along those lines. And it was basically, she went to consult God, like an oracle or something along those lines, at the school of Shem and Eber, and they were the ones who gave, so she asked them, they asked God, God responded back with an answer, and she got the answer. None of that is in the Torah. There was just a little bit of discomfort with Rebecca getting a direct response from God. Right.
Shem was alive. I checked to get the dates to make sure when I was.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
he was
right.
Still alive because he lived.
Shem and Eber,
yeah,
they lived a very long time.
Yeah.
Lived a very long time. So yeah, you have those notions, you have those ideas. But the idea that there is, Abraham makes a covenant with God. What does the covenant consist of? The covenant in the book of Genesis is, Abraham, I want you to go where I'm going to tell you. I want you to basically do what I ask, right? And worship me, and I will be your God. There isn't that much other content. Well, eventually we get to circumcision, but God doesn't tell Abraham that at first. There is the covenant of circumcision, which comes later, right? So what is God going to give Abraham? God is going to give Abraham land, wealth, and children. Land, wealth, and children. That is the covenant in Genesis. Right? And it's stated a few different times. The covenant after slavery, it is very different, and we'll talk about that covenant. And so Abraham and Sarah, Avram and Sarai. I mean, on the one hand, it's really interesting. Abraham gets to, we tend to think about Abraham as being blessed, right? In general, that's kind of the idea. We look at all of this great blessing for Abraham. And what happens to Abraham? He arrives in Canaan. He travels all the way, brings his family and everybody else, arrive in Canaan, and there's a famine. And he goes down to Egypt, and Sarah ends up getting kidnapped or taken into the Pharaoh's, of Egypt's, or the king of Egypt's house, right? Until, we finally realize that no, it's not his sister, it's actually his wife. He gets to go back with a lot of wealth and riches. Then he and Lot have this big dispute, right? And so they have to split up. Lot ends up getting kidnapped. We don't always read about that part. Abraham has to go be a warlord and conquer some kings in order to get Lot back. He still doesn't have any children yet. But it's actually a lot of strife for Abraham. It's not easy for him. And when he has trouble having children and he has kids with Hagar, then she gets kicked out of the house, right? And then she gets to come back, right? And then, it's one thing after another. If we really look objectively at Abraham, not necessarily at his holiness or his righteousness, but at just at what happens in his life, it's really, really hard. Now, in terms of the idea that, Sarah was equal to, now Sarah is considered a prophetess within Judaism. It's just really hard to see. It's really hard to see some level of equality. Sarah runs the household. Abraham runs the business, right? And that's kind of, within Orthodox Judaism, that's basically the notion of gender equality. which is separate but equal, right? Men have these responsibilities, women have these responsibilities. It's nothing like what we would say would reflect second wave or third wave feminism. It's just not, right? You can be, I think, a second or third wave feminist and also be orthodox, right? Like I know people that are very much fall into that category, right? But in terms of the Bible, as far as that's concerned, I just don't. I mean, I don't see it in that way, right? Sarah doesn't have a say in so much, right? But she does have a say in some things, right? But when you take a look at Abraham and Sarah and the different trials and tribulations they go through, right? There is, I mean, everything from the binding of Isaac, right? And for all of those stories, there's so much written. There's so many commentaries on the book of Genesis. And to take a look at these, and I want to actually, as we are going through this, I want to just point out one website. It is really, really great. So this one website that is really, really great is called Safaria. You can't see my head. That's okay, because you can see this. Safaria.org. Safaria.org is an entire Jewish library online. And much of what they have, there we go, I want to make sure everybody can see that. Much of what they have at Safaria.org is in English. There's lots of stuff that's not in English, lots of stuff that's all in Hebrew. But in terms of the Bible, in terms of many midrashim, in terms of a lot of commentaries, like Rashi's commentary, entirely in English. Right? You have Sforno's commentaries in English, and some stuff in Ibn Ezra, not a lot. But there, I mean, you have a lot of great resources at Safaria, and so, and it's pretty easy to use. Like each verse, you go through the biblical verse, and it's got a little dot next to it. You click on the dot, and it pops up all of the different commentaries next door, and so you can take a look at all the different commentaries that you want. The commentaries, references of that verse somewhere in the Talmud. All the Talmud is in English, right? I mean, it's really, really phenomenal. And so feel free to also donate and support Safaria because they are providing an excellent resource and they do it for free. So this is a good one to spend, you know, $5 or $20 or $50 to say thank you for providing this great resource. Right? It's a good thing to do, or more. And so you have a lot of trials and tribulations with regard to Abraham and Sarah, binding of Isaac. Again, we can talk about that a lot. There's so much there. With regard to Isaac and Rebekah is really interesting because Isaac is often the most overlooked patriarch, right? The idea that Rebekah has more complete control over this situation, right? The idea of her as gender equality, maybe you can point to in terms of that one relationship, right? That Isaac is very much a passive figure in certain ways, although he is also a businessman. He does dig wells, and he's very good at digging wells, as it turns out. You also, Isaac and Rebekah are literally caught, they're caught mitzvahing. You know, like they're caught, which actually one biblical commentator translates that as conjugal cuddling. But the mitzachek is same root as yitzchak, which is laughter. But they're basically caught fooling around. It's the only, other than Jacob and Rachel's kiss at the well, you don't you don't have a lot of public displays of affection with regard to our patriarchs and matriarchs. And so it is kind of noteworthy that while Isaac is often seen as the more passive one, Isaac is seen as the one who gets taken advantage of, that Rebekah instructs Jacob, right, to deceive his father, right? Those kinds of notions puts Isaac in more of a compromising kind of a situation. It turns out that at least in this one instance, you actually see something resembling affection, right, within the patriarchs and matriarchs. We don't see. We only see so much affection in the Bible, so it's noteworthy. It's noteworthy. I put Rebecca into the prophetess realm. I actually did a linguistic analysis of the whole idea of like the word that she uses to inquire, right? Which are most rabbis, you'll see the commentaries one after the other saying that she went to inquire somewhere, right? And I disagree with that wholeheartedly, but that's okay. When it comes to Jacob, whose name gets changed to Israel, Rachel, and Leah, you have Jacob deceiving his brother Esau, trading the birthright and the blessing, and stealing the blessing. It's very interesting because Jacob does not come across as the most moral of characters, right? And even when he's stealing the blessing from his father, right, our Bible is kind of saying, go for it, right? Because Rebecca heard that the younger was going to be over the older, right? She followed this understanding. Jacob, there's a number of little pieces that you see within Jacob and Esau in that story. By the way, you take a look at the rabbinic commentaries. Rabbinic commentaries reflect ancient biases and modern biases. Like it says that Esau is born with red hair. Rashi's commentary is that means he's going to grow up and be a murderer. That does not mean that everybody with red hair, right, is going to necessarily grow up to be a murderer, right? However, most, right? Exactly, right? But that notion comes from the fact that Esau becomes the father of Edom, one of the ancient Israelites' enemies. And Edom is seen as eventually transforming itself into Rome, who destroys the Second Temple. So Esau gets a lot of negative commentary, right? And it's harsh. Some of the things that are said, and you read through and you're like, well, Esau's not that bad of a guy. You know, he's a little bit uncouth. So he's like enjoys hunting or this, that, or the other. What's wrong with that? Well, our rabbis have a lot that's wrong with that. And this is based on Midrash. And so you see that in Rabbinic Judaism, we also have bias that exists, right? It's not necessarily a surprise, but again, our rabbis were human too, right? But some of these biases become sacred teachings, right? And that's where we have run into problems, right, with sacred teachings sometimes. And unfortunately, we have borne the brunt of that at times as well. Marriage to Rachel and Leah, there's great stories that are told, rabbinic stories about how did Jacob not know, right, that it was, that it wasn't Rachel, it was Leah who he married first, right? And you get stories of great compassion, that Rachel and Jacob knew Laban was a trickster kind of a thing and might try to pull something on him, so they had some signs. And when Rachel realizes that she's not going to get to marry him, but Leah goes first, instead of letting her sister get embarrassed, she teaches her the signs, right? Well, no, right? Well, it makes sense within the context of the story. B, it speaks of the loving relationship between sisters, right? In that sense of that notion of sacrifice, that idea that certain relationships are more important than others. As much as Rachel loved Jacob, she couldn't see that or bear that happening to her sister, Leah, right? And so there's all sorts of stories that go along those lines that help us to understand, that help to teach us, again, about life, because that's what it's about. It's about life. That's what we see over and over again with all of these imperfect families, because they are very imperfect families. And I mean, Joseph and his brothers is obviously where things, well, they go really wrong. Yeah. So, well, first of all, Bilhah and Zilpah are mentioned, right? And not only that, I mean, you take a look at, Reuven even has an affair with, I don't remember if it was, I think it was Bilhah, not Zilpah. Oh yeah, right, that happens. And so, yeah, wives, they are considered wives. They're also considered concubines. They're all, I mean, they were servants of Rachel and Leah, similar to a Hagar situation, right? And so they didn't have equal status, but yes, the four matriarchs are, I mean, essentially the four matriarchs of the tribes of Israel are not Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. It's Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah. But they don't have the same. They do not have the same level of standing in Jewish tradition. But yes, we can acknowledge them. It's important to acknowledge them. And so, but I mean, Joseph and his brothers, you have not only favoritism now taken to just a terrible extent, right? The Coat of Many Colors, even though it does make for a very entertaining musical. Everybody has seen it. Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. It is good and very creative, and actually also follows the story pretty accurately. Like Andrew Lloyd Webber does a pretty good job of not just making stuff up when it comes to the Bible. Like I thought Jesus Christ Superstar did a good job with too. But the idea of Joseph and his there's all sorts of great commentary that comes along these lines, like little things, like Joseph was sent out to find his brothers, and he came across this man near Dothan, or like something along. It says it's a man, and many rabbinic commentators will say it's an angel, because Joseph didn't have to ask or explain who his brothers were. This person just kind of knew where his brothers were. And so there's no explanation given. And they're actually saying that this had to happen, right? Because to get Joseph where he needed to go so he could go down to Egypt so he could be the savior, right? And there's those kinds of things. This is very much, Joseph's story is very much about God's plan, how we can't see ourselves, and we don't know how it's going to end. We're in the midst of God's plan, right? Almost killed by his brothers, sold into slavery by his brothers, accused of adultery, right, when he was nothing but righteous, and Joseph ends up in jail. And that's where the Torah reading, it's such a big story that the Torah reading is split. And you end up with the ending is that the cupbearer who was freed forgot Joseph. And that's where it ends. And it's a phenomenal ending, because it shows you until we get to the end of the story, we don't know for sure how it's going to end. No matter how dire, no matter how terrible the circumstances are looking, it's something that we take heart in. right? I mean, if we stop the Jewish story in 1945, right, it looks pretty grim. It obviously still is, you know, very grim and the darkest part of our terrible and long history, right? But you see these notions that are very, very important all the way through, right? Joseph isn't you always highlighted again, and you have rabbinic interpretation that might suggest otherwise. Mary is an Egyptian, right? Interfaith marriage, those kinds of things. Those things are a part of and happen. The whole reconciliation that takes place is really, really beautiful, really powerful on many different levels. Like Joseph, the Joseph story, not everything in the Bible is good literature. Joseph's story is great literature. It really is. It's so powerful, and there's so much that's there that's a part of it. However, it is noteworthy that at the end of the book of Genesis, the covenant of Genesis has not been fulfilled. At the end of the book of Genesis, the covenant of Genesis, the covenant with Abraham, has not been fulfilled. We have wealth. We have now children. But we don't have the land. Right? It's very, very interesting to think about that. And except for one verse, maybe it's two verses, but together in the Abraham story, there is no indication, none, about what's about to happen. There is zero, except for one verse that gets tossed in there, there is zero foreshadowing of slavery. And in those verses, which is in Genesis chapter 15, God basically tells Abraham, you're going to be awesome. You're going to die at a ripe old age, 184 as it turns out. But your descendants may be enslaved for 400 years. Thanks, God. You're doing great, right? Thank you so much. I mean, think about that. And other than that one verse, there is zero foreshadowing. We have no clue that what's about to happen. It's not what Abraham signed up for. It's very, very interesting. And so we get to Genesis, and we get to Moses. And again, numerous stories about Moses. What's the first thing Moses does in the Torah? First active thing that Moses does. He kills somebody. But before we get into like Moses's like murderer, we also want to acknowledge that the stuff that the Pharaoh uses for slavery, right, after he has forgotten Joseph and forgotten Joseph's explanations and support and whatnot, is that the Pharaoh bases the hatred and the fear of the Jews on things like, well, on fear. It's the enslavement of the Jews is based on fear. And that's still very much the way that people rile other people up. It's based on fear. Fear that is often unfounded. Right? And we still see that today in many different respects. Moses and Moses' story, I mean, again, like we do a lot of this with regard to the Passover story. And we talk about that a lot. We will talk a little bit more about the Passover story. But Moshe, it's important to note that Moses is also called Moshe Rabbeinu, which is Moses, our teacher. In Rabbinic Judaism, that idea of Moses as teacher, Moses who receives the Torah, is just as, if not more important, right, than Moses who leads the people out. Because it's not Moses who's leading the people out. From a Jewish perspective, who frees the Israelites from slavery? God, not Moses. right? And that's kind of where we come from as far as that goes. But you have this idea, you have this wonderful story of slavery to redemption. We don't have a lot of historical evidence for it. However, the idea and the notion of slavery to redemption is something that our people and many people have experienced over and over and over throughout history. You do not have to think of the story of the Exodus from Egypt as history in spite of the History Channel television shows that will prove the possibility of the 10 plagues and this, that, and the other. There are plenty of shows on the History Channel that you can see, or at least there used to be. I'm assuming there still are. Has anybody watched them? Yeah? Right? I mean, they're interesting, right? I mean, they are interesting. They've got great tension and build-up and this, that, and the other. We do not have any kind of conclusive archaeological proof that the Exodus from Egypt happened, that any of the plagues happened, etc. Right? You have archaeologists that will try to provide explanations and possibilities, and this is what it could have been like, and tries to envision it, and this, that, and the other. And so that happens, right? That's normal. But it's, right, but it's, while we don't have archaeological proof, this is the human story told over and over and over again. There's a reason why oppressed peoples from many different cultures and societies and experiences have found inspiration through this story. I mean, it is hugely, hugely significant. And there's, and the idea of, I mean, all the way through you have rabbinic commentary on every aspect, right? From descriptions of what the darkness looked like, or how the hail had fire inside the hail, and how God could make, this happen. And there's all of these different understandings, a lot of storytelling to help explain it, right? You really do have a lot of different kinds of pieces there. And again, splitting of the sea. I think, does Telushkin talk about, I think he does talk about the idea of the midrash about the angels starting to celebrate when the waves crash down, right? Telushkin does cover that, right? And people are people, but angelic beings can't take a side. Right? I mean, it's a really powerful lesson. It's a powerful lesson about that we may, you shouldn't rejoice too much, right? But angels, right? Talk about the nature of angels, right? They have to do what God says. But God is acknowledging that the loss of life, even of terrible, horrible people, right, who've oppressed, right, is still loss of life. And that kind of a notion is a really important notion. It speaks to our humanity in really beautiful and powerful ways. With regard to Revelation, the moment at Sinai, you should know that the 10 Commandments that we see in Genesis or Exodus chapter 20 and the 10 Commandments that you see in Deuteronomy chapter 5 are different, slightly, but they are different. You also have other 10 Commandments. 10 Commandments in, for example, Exodus 34. And there's another 10 Commandments. I mean, there's a lot of 10 Commandments, unfortunately, or fortunately. There's a lot of diversity. But the most important thing about this idea of revelation is that God spoke to this understanding, this notion, this idea that God spoke to the entirety of the Jewish people. Right? That is the heart and the core of Revelation. That's the heart and the core of the Sinai moment. God speaks to the entirety of the Jewish people. Right? And then there's all sorts of stories around this. I mean, like one of my favorite is the idea that God speaks to everyone according to their understanding. And so if you were wise, if you were a fool, if you were old, if you were young, if you were a child, if you were, right, God speaks to everyone according to their understanding, which is beautiful, right? The idea that the Torah, access to Judaism, all of it, it's accessible. We should never feel that it's not accessible, that it's beyond us, right? And in Deuteronomy, we actually see those words as well. But that's a big part of the rabbinic understanding of Revelation. You also have, right, other stories that are told of Revelation where God speaks and our souls fly away. We all die. And so hundreds of thousands of angels go and catch our souls and bring them back. And then we say, Moses, you can talk to God from here on out. Right? We don't need to do that anymore. And so, I mean, there's all, again, which one is true? Well, are there overwhelming moments in our lives? Do we want Jewish, right? What's the lesson of the day? How do we understand it? With the Torah, with the notion of the Torah, we change the brit, we change the covenant. We go from something that is, go here and I'll be your God and I'll give you stuff, to follow these laws. Again, circumcision was given earlier, but you get the idea. The idea of a law-based, a holiday-based, right? You didn't see any of that in Genesis at all. That only comes about post-Revelation. A little bit pre, but basically post-Revelation. So the covenant changes. And the Decalogue, what's the Decalogue? It's a way of saying the 10 Commandments. And in Hebrew, it's actually more literally translated the 10 utterances, or the 10 things, right, that were said. They are important, but they're not the most important. Everybody, if you ask anyone how many commandments there are, one of the first things that most people will say is there's 10. From a Jewish standpoint, there's 613. For everyone else, there's 7. The 10 commandments are so important because this was the moment of Sinai. But what's the most important thing about the moment of Sinai? It's not the Decalogue. It's that God spoke to the people. Because the Decalogue, thou shalt not murder. It's important. It's very important. Thank God it says don't murder. Because otherwise, I mean, Pamela would, you can just tell. I mean, she would be murdering people left and right, right? Don't steal. Don't murder, don't steal have been a part of every legal code ever. Like ever. So why are they so significant? Well, those, you have to say it. It have to be in your legal code. You also have things like don't covet. Is that even possible? To never ever covet what somebody else has. And what about all the stuff that isn't in there? Love your neighbor as yourself. Don't hate another in your heart. Give tzedakah, right? Give charitable giving to other people. You don't see that in the 10 Commandments, right? So we could argue if the 10 Commandments are the most important commandments. That's what it said. That's what it talks about. That's what's written in a few different places, even though there's slight differences. But not in terms of the basic content. But the biggest difference is the reason for Shabbat, right? In one, you have, what's the reason for Shabbat? God rested on creation. What's the other? We're not slaves anymore. Which one is more important? You can debate that. I think they're both pretty important, right? So but you have these notions, you have these differences. The tabernacle. Speaking of Shabbat, the tabernacle becomes this idea. I mean, it becomes the basis of the temple. It's this thing that we build out with all this gold and precious yarns and metals and all sorts of great stuff. we stole it from the Egyptians with God's permission. That's at least the rabbinic interpretation of it, like as to where we got all this stuff, right? We don't really know where we got all this stuff. We're telling stories here, but but again, the rabbis do say, look, God told us to go and borrow from the Egyptians, and that was our payment, right? We can talk about reparations, right? That's kind of coming up nowadays. Although I did hear the most incredible Jewish argument in favor of reparations. Yeah, it's actually there's a very good Jewish argument for reparations. That would be a whole nother talk. But the idea of the tabernacle becomes the basis for work that we're supposed to refrain from on Shabbat, right? There's 39 categories of work, and all of them have to do with building the tabernacle. Because it says on Shabbat, don't work, rest. But when you're out in the desert, what does that mean? Right? So I'm not going to pick up manna, right? I mean, think about it. Like, there has to be some level of explanation, and our rabbis provide it, right? These 39 categories of work, this is what it means when it comes to how you do it on Shabbat. And the tabernacle is kind of the basis for it. The golden calf, and we might wrap up here, and I'll give a moment for questions. But the golden calf moment is basically seen as one of the darkest moments from a rabbinic perspective out of anything. Horrors with babies being thrown into the Nile, by Pharaoh and the Egyptians. But I mean, this is seen as like we did like the worst thing ever. God has freed us. God has given us the Torah. Just because Moses is up there for a while getting the Torah, right? We all heard, God speak. And so we go ahead and build the golden calf. And the gold, according to Jewish tradition, I want to say, I'm almost positive that golden calf, according to Jewish tradition, happened on Tisha B'Av, right? The 9th of Av, which is the most tragic and saddest day of the Jewish calendar. This is why the temples would have been destroyed on the 9th of Av. Like all these kinds of interpretations that our rabbis will lay on the golden calf. And so there's if you read, again, Exodus 32, 33, 34 very carefully, you also will see that there's a different version of the Ten Commandments in there as well, and the aftermath. This is also where you get the idea of the second set of 10 Commandments that is, that are written just like the first ones, which is very interesting. And they have to specify that. So there's a lot of great teachings that come with it, but for the most part, people are familiar with a lot of this stuff, right? There's other parts of the Bible that maybe you're not as familiar with, and we'll spend a little bit of time on that next time. So comments, questions, how's everybody doing? We covered a lot of ground. I had a feeling that I borrow this for a moment. A feeling we weren't going to cover everything, but we got pretty close. We actually did better than last year. So, any questions?
Don't you think on the golden calf that because they waited so long for Moses to come back, they just gave up? A lot of that was part of it too.
So the question was, well, for the golden calf, they had to wait a really long time. So wouldn't they have just given up? And again, I see this as a story about human fallibility, right? That no matter what we are given, no matter how much we're promised that lollipop, right? I mean, there's uncertainty. We have darkness within us. We don't always know. How can a people, in spite of all the miraculous things that have happened, the idea that a people would get rid of that darkness, that uncertainty, that worry, that anxiety. Are you kidding me? We're the Jewish people. Like, anxiety? We're experts, and we've been experts for a very, very long time, right? So it is possible. It's definitely, I mean, we can give lots of explanations. A lot of our rabbis don't have any compassion for the Israelites, by the way, right? None. Like, they get what they deserve, and how could they do that? And it was terrible, and there's not a lot of compassion. But we can understand why there might be some compassion. There's a lot of different possibilities.
Doesn't also apply to our individual lives. Don't always be looking for this miracle that's going to occur in our particular life.
Sometimes we have to be patient. Sometimes good things can happen if we wait, right? That waiting does not mean the end of the world. That if we have a course, right, in spite of the uncertainty that we feel, sometimes we should give up. I actually was just on there's How I Built This. There's a show on NPR, and this guy who's done pretty well for himself making wool shoes. I don't know if you've heard of these things or not, but yeah, he's from Australia, and he was ready to give up right when he was about to try to put together a little promo, right, for it. And he basically had to get dragged to the promo, and he wasn't really excited about it at all. And it turned out to work out pretty well for him, right? I mean, we have those moments of uncertainty. It's hard to stay the course. It's hard to have faith. For anyone who has ever lost faith and then realized that maybe I made the wrong choice, the golden calf story is for you, right? I mean, like, there's so many different areas that it's relevant. It's a reflection of humanity.
Abraham and Sarah having, him going ahead and having Ishmael, not waiting for Isaac.
That was at her behest.
I know.
That was at her
But
behest.
still,
Yeah.
that was impatience.
That was
For that
impatience.
final
Well, now,
clicking.
here's the thing, though. I mean, look, the whole Abraham-Sarah story, what is the lesson in terms of Isaac's birth? Nothing is too great for God. It specifically says that Sarah was past the way of women. She was in menopause and beyond. I mean, the woman was 90 years old.
Yeah.
Although there was just a story of someone who was like, how old? 70? 70 years old who just gave birth? We're getting pretty close to Sarah, right? I mean, that was pretty amazing. So, all right. So, but that's where we're going to leave it there. Oh, sorry. We're going to leave it there. And so we will see you not next week. We've got a little bit of a pause. Take a look at the schedule for the next time. I think it's going to be literally about 4 or 5 weeks, just so because of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and then on Sukkot, the first day of Sukkot and the last day of Sukkot happen to be on Sunday evening, beginning on Sunday evening. So we're going to have to wait until, is it October 27th? Oh, we do have next week. Never mind. We have next week. Come next week, wait for next week, and then we'll go on hiatus until October 27th. Thank you for that correction. All right, we're signing out.